Tralkasaurus. Tralkasaurus, meaning thunder lizard, is a genus of abelosaurid dinosaur from the Huincal Formation from Rio Negro province in Argentina. The type and only species is Tralkasaurus cuyi, named in 2020 by Mauricio Cerrone and colleagues based on an incomplete skeleton. A medium-sized abelosaurid, Tralkasaurus exhibits a conflicting blend of characteristics found among the early diverging abelosauroids with others that characterize the highly specialized clade Bryrostra, and thus its position within the clade is poorly resolved. Discovery and naming. The Violante Farm fossil site in Rio Negro province, Argentina, near the village of El Cuy, was discovered in 1999 by Sebastián Apstgy on the north shore of the Ezequiel Ramos Mejia Reservoir. In a 2018 conference abstract, Matias Mota and colleagues reported new fossil discoveries, including a diverse fauna of dinosaurs, made at the Violante Farm site. The strata exposed are yellowish and greenish sandstones that are occasionally tufaceous, i.e. bearing volcanic ash, which belong to the Cenomanian Turonian Huincal Formation. The specimens discovered included an incomplete skeleton of an abelosaurid, catalogued as MPCAPV 815, which comprises a maxilla, dorsal, sacral, and caudal vertebrae, cervical ribs, and a badly preserved pubis. Mota and colleagues recognized that this abelosaurid, along with the coelurosaur and carcharodontosaurid, present distinct traits, autapomorphies, from other Huincal Formation theropods. The abelosaurid was formally named in 2020 by Mauricio Cerrone and colleagues as Tralkasaurus cuyi. The generic name is formed from Tralka, the Mapudungun word for thunder, and the suffix saurus, meaning lizard, while the specific name refers to the village of El Cuy. Description. Tralkasaurus was described by Cerrone and colleagues as a medium-sized abelosaurid based on the available material. Its maxilla has a length of 22 cm, 8.7 in, smaller than that of the similarly medium-sized Scorpiovenator, at 32 cm, 13 in, with the whole animal measuring 6 meters, 20 feet, long. It is most comparable to the smallest known abelosaurid, MMCHPV 69, from the Candelaris Formation, with Tralkasaurus pubis measuring 35 cm, 14 in, long and MMCHPV 69's pubis measuring 41 cm, 16 in, long. The maxilla of Tralkasaurus is a subtriangular bone covered in neurovascular foramina, pits formed by innervation, and rugosities, roughened areas. It encloses the antorbital fenestra from the front. Tralkasaurus is unique among abelosaurids in that front margin of the antorbital fenestra slopes forwards and upwards, instead of being vertical or sloping backwards. The antorbital fenestra creates fossae on both the upward projecting process of the maxilla and, atypically among abelosaurids, the inner surface of the bone. This condition is more similar to basal abelosauroids like Noasaurus and Magicosaurus, as well as the Avastra. Deep neurovascular grooves extend downward from the bottom rim of the antorbital fenestra, which is unlike Carnotaurus, Equixanatosaurus, Majungasaurus, and Scorpiovenator but similar to Rugops. More typically, the ascending process tapers and becomes laminar, sheet-like, at the top, like Scorpiovenator, Carnotaurus, and Majungasaurus. The maxilla also bears 11 sockets with 4 preserved teeth, which are typical of abelosauриds. Like Majungasaurus but unlike Scorpiovenator, the serrations on both edges of the teeth are the same size. Based on comparisons with Carnotaurus and Majungasaurus, the dorsal vertebrae of Tralkasaurus originated from the mid to rear back. The transverse processes that extend out and upward are subtriangular like those of Diholocli, Viavenator, Majungasaurus, and Magicosaurus, but unlike the subrectangular processes of Carnotaurus. The parapophyses that project out and downward are distinctive among abelosaurids in their unusual narrowness and shortness. Even in abelosaurids like Majungasaurus and MCF-PVPH 237, where the parapophyses are relatively narrow, they are not as rod-like as in Tralkasaurus. A ridge between them, the dorsal paradipophyseal lamina, is also shallow and relatively low, unlike the strongly developed ridges in Carnotaurus, Majungasaurus, and Illicolesia. Another ridge, the posterior paradipophyseal lamina, is robust and crosscuts a fossa below the transverse process, the infradipophyseal fossa, like Diholocli. The large transverse processes of the caudal vertebrae, which originated from the front of the tail, are typically abelosaurid, projecting strongly out and upward like Carnotaurus, Scorpiovenator, Aucasaurus, and Viavenator, but are more inclined than Majungasaurus. Processes projecting forwards and backwards at their tips would have been overlapping between caudal vertebrae. This is a distinguishing characteristic of the Bryrostra. Meanwhile, although the pubis is poorly preserved, The pubic apron at its tip appears to have been expanded, like Rhyolosaurus but unlike Magicosaurus or Carnotaurus. Classification. Cerrone and colleagues conducted a phylogenetic analysis to determine the affinities of Tralkasaurus. They found that it possesses synapomorphies of the Abelisauridae, a maxilla with a deep body, low ascending process, and reduced maxillary fossa, covered by foramina and rugosities, fused interdental plates lining the inside of the maxillary tooth row bearing strong vertical ridges, the subdivision of the infradiapophyseal fossae by the posterior paradiapophyseal laminae, a connection between the transverse processes and parapophyses by the dorsal paradiapophyseal laminae, large transverse processes strongly inclined upwards on the caudal vertebrae, and a thin pubic shaft. They also identified the forward inclined front margin of the antorbital fenestra and its excavation of the body of the maxilla, the rod-like parapophyses, and the low paradiapophyseal laminae as autapomorphies of Tralkasaurus. Within the Abelisauridae, the position of Tralkasaurus was more poorly resolved. In particular, it exhibits a conflicting blend of characteristics. The projections on the caudal transverse processes are typical of the Brarostra, but the presence of extensive antorbital fossae on the maxilla is plesiomorphic, i.e. characteristic of basal abelisauroids, and unlike other abelisaurids. The phylogenetic analysis accordingly placed Tralkasaurus among basal abelisaurids, but was unable to resolve its affinities beyond a polytomy, collapsed tree. The resulting phylogenetic tree is partially reproduced below. Paleoecology. Numerous theropods are known from the Violante Farm fossil site, including Gualico and Aeoniraptor, which may or may not represent the same Megaraptoran, the Carcharodontosaur Pterovenator, a coelurosaur, identified by Cerrone and colleagues as an unenlagene, and another Carcharodontosaur that remain unnamed, but are likely distinct species, and another indeterminate Megaraptoran. Other dinosaurs also include a titanosaurian sauropod and an ornithopod. Additional vertebrates from the Violante Farm site include the alanodontid rhynchocephalian Patagossphenos, a crocodiliform, possibly belonging to the Neosuchia, a squamate, a chelid turtle, and a fish referred to lepidotes.